good evening. I'd like to welcome you again to the third installment of our Evening at Egan series for the fall semester. Thank you very much for coming out. We had our facilities people sprinkle the mountains with snow as an additional enticement, and I thought they did a wonderful job. The Chancellor has bid me to make one announcement, and given that it is our Chancellor, I will do that. On Friday, October 23rd, the UAS Alumni Association is hosting the 9th annual beer and wine tasting. One of their board members, Venetia Santana, is in the outer lobby with tickets for you. I'd encourage you to attend. You can also call the Chancellor's office or order by phone on the UAS website. Last week, I mentioned that we have a wonderful display of topics for you this semester, from seabirds, clay, Afghanistan, oil spills, pianos, and predator control. It's kind of hard to beat the diversity of things that it's possible to find a few brief moments of engagement with on a Friday evening, but I think it's an example of the wonders that are this little place here in Juneau, Alaska. Next week, we will host a discussion by Dr. Ricky Ott on the ongoing and lingering social and political effects of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So I'd encourage you to attend. I think that'll be a fascinating discussion by a woman who has spent a substantial amount of time studying that. Tonight, however, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague in Arts and Sciences, Professor Robin Walz. And when we were designing the program for this fall, it really struck me, and it strikes me again tonight, that the enchantment of this place in terms of its physical beauty, particularly on an evening and an afternoon like today, is such an obvious part of our community. But there are, in the form of various prodigious minds in our little university, an assortment of forms of enchantment, one of which you're going to hear about tonight. I overheard a couple of people last week who were looking at the idea of a discussion on shady detectives and clever criminals in French literature, and you could see one eyebrow raised rather high in consternation as to what that might be. But this is, to me, the reason that we are so lucky as a community, I think, to have a university that gives an opportunity for this sort of intellectual enchantment, and equally important, an opportunity for us to display the very best of our academics, who are indeed enchanted in ways that it would take several years to display to you. But it really, I would encourage you to look, for example, at the Henderson Building and the display of ceramics from our faculty and their progeny, their intellectual progeny in the form of our students, and the enormous range of possibilities for enchantment that this evening represents only a small portion of. Professor Walz has been a member of our history department here. He's produced a number of interesting works, one of more recent ones on modernism, but a number of works on French cultural history, and I couldn't be happier to introduce him to you and give you Dr. Walz. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you here coming here this evening. It's I'm surprised and pleased and a little scared to see so many people here this evening. But it's wonderful to have everyone here. A couple of thanks before I'm going to switch glasses here, because one thing about passing 50 is that I can't use the same glasses for everything. I want to thank Katie Bosler and Heather Hadley, and especially Allison Caputo, for arranging and organizing this evening presentation. Allison made this wonderful flyer. And Sarah Hagan at the UAS bookstore She's got a nice display of my French crime stuff organized at the bookstore, and it'll be there for a while yet. And then I want to thank some people that you wouldn't know about. It's the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France, where I got to spend last spring's sabbatical, spending 4 months working in this area. I had a residency fellowship there with a collection of international scholars and working artists. And much of the research and writing that I did during that time is what goes into this evening's presentation. Okay. All right. I want to start out with this slide here. This is some famous people commemorative stamps. They were issued by the French Postal Service, this series in 1996. The French Post Office has issued these commemorative stamps ever since 1952. They're fundraisers for the Red Cross, sort of like the breast cancer stamps here in the United States. And since 1952, they've had this famous people series. And this was typically these famous people are writers, poets, scientists, biologists, heroes of the French Revolution, singers, entertainers, you know, people like that. And in 1996, however, it was the first time that fictional characters became famous people in French stamps. And these are 6 heroes of the French detective novel, which is called the roman policier in French. And the curious thing about these heroes of the French detective novel is that 3 of them are criminals. And I made the larger ones there. Rocambole, he was a long series of novels. For the first half of the series, he's a hardened criminal. He kills people, he steals them, he's engaged in all kinds of fleecing schemes. A later one, the next 2 are early 20th century. Arsène Lupin is the gentleman burglar. He solves crimes, but usually he blackmails people into paying him as a result of him working for them. Fantomas is just pure evil. He's the Lord of Terror, and he has no redeeming features whatsoever. And as for the others, there's Rouletabille. He's a journalist. I suppose journalists are sort of like detectives, right? But his father was a mastermind criminal. And Inspector Maigret, finally, we get a policeman, you know, among the heroes of the French police. And then Nestor Burma, the shock detective. He actually is a private investigator, which is not too far off, but he was like an anarchist before he became a private investigator, and he has no real great love for the police. So how is it when there's 6 fictional characters, these become the heroes of the French roman policier, the detective novels? And to provide a point of contrast, I thought I'd take a couple of slides to sort of do what is the canonical account of the rise of the detective and then the crime novel. That's the way it's told in the Anglo-American tradition. You get the rise of the detective novel, and then afterwards, as a further development, permutations, the crime novel. So the standard story is it starts with Edgar Allan Poe in the 1840s with his 3 Dupin mysteries, Auguste Dupin mysteries, the Murders in the Rue Morgue, and as you can see through the Purloined Letter. Poe starts with the idea, he's literally an armchair detective, Dupin, and he solves crimes by thinking like a criminal. He doesn't even actually go out and do investigative work. He just thinks like a criminal, and then he puzzles through or he logically figures out what he's doing. Sherlock Holmes, obviously, is another kind of milestone in the detective novel. He combines his powers of reason with collecting a few bits of evidence, and then he deduces these entire crime scenarios and the culprit. And then often the pinnacle of this tradition is given to Agatha Christie with the development of the whodunit puzzle mystery, right? You've got some kind of crime, you've got a whole collection of people who are possible criminals. She sort of like works through all the elements, eliminates the false ones, and the Poirot and Miss Marple are her, famous detectives. And then the way this version of the story goes is that somewhere along the Depression, you get the development of the crime novel, okay, as a kind of a variation on, even a parody of the detective novel. And that starts off with our hard-boiled crew like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. They have these characters who are lone private investigators who inhabit a corrupt world, but then live according to their independent moral code. A PI that's in some ways more of an avenger than a police detective. But then we get these policemen again. I call them the tough guy cops, you know. These are the kinds of cops that don't mind pistol whipping suspects or sexy women who get out of line. This is the stuff of Spicy Detective and other pulp magazines from the 1940s and 50s. And then we have these crime novels, the development of what gets called as a genre crime novels, where violence, whether it's actual or psychological violence, takes center stage. The cops may still be principal characters, but like the criminals, they're deeply immersed in this murky and violent world of crime, and they're as tormented and psychologically disturbed often as the criminals they're pursuing. And then lastly, you know, toward the end of the 20th century, after mid-century, we get a focus on novels that are actually about sociopaths and psycho killers, right? I think it starts with Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley. The Matt Damon movie is like, it's not good. It's not good Highsmith, because Tom Ripley is just completely amoral. He's without, and he does all these terrible things. He kills these people, and like nothing ever happens to him, you know? And then all the way to, I have yet to read any of the Dexter novels, but I've watched some of the TV series. I mean, we've got this TV series now where a guy who is a serial killer is the hero of the series, okay? All right. Okay. Now, where I'm going with this, to give that arc, that angle, is that in France, we have a different development of the trajectory altogether. It's like we first and foremost have the glorification of crime. The glorification of crime comes first. It's as old as the printing press itself in France. Little stories about rogues, ruffians, highwaymen, and criminal gangs, and things that were called Bibliothèque Bleue chapbooks. They were called that. A large sheet of paper, if you know how like page signatures work, you press many pages at once and then you fold it all up so it has a common binding on the back. They would print up these 16, 24, or 36-page chapbooks, and then they would wrap them in blue butcher paper, and that's where the blue came from. They were called Bibliothèque Bleue because they were wrapped in this blue paper. In the 16th and 17th century, typically these chapbooks, crime stories were about human monsters, people who were either part human and part animal, or were human beings who didn't have souls. They were monsters as well. Or they would be legendary thieves, criminals, or gypsies. A lot of books about gypsies as criminals. By the 18th century, however, contemporary criminals were being turned into sort of instantaneous heroes within a year or two of their executions. And one of the famous of these is Cartouche, Louis Dominique Cartouche. See, did I put his? No, I didn't put his. He was born in 1693 and was executed in 1721. He was the son of a Parisian wine barrel cooper who turned to crime as a life of crime as a child and ran away with the gypsies. He had a brief brush in the military as a young man, and then he was only ever a young man. He returned to Paris and became a flamboyant thief in his own right, although claimed he only murdered in self-defense, and the leader of a vast criminal gang in Paris. The police had their number at over 750 persons, which was the actual number used by the police to do a group trial of criminals, actually just mostly poor people of Paris that they'd rounded up. They were all charged with the crime of being accomplices of Cartouche. Over 300 of those 750 people were killed executed for that supposed crime. Okay? Finally, Cartouche was, despite his exploits, he would disguise himself to get away, used aliases. He's finally captured in 1721. He gives his final supplication or his confession for his sins and asking for forgiveness before being ripped alive on the wheel. The point that I'm trying to make here is that Cartouche became an instant legend among the poorer people of Paris, okay, for whom the Paris police were a greater threat to their lives and their livelihood than the occasional criminal. Okay? The police are far more despised in Paris in the 18th century than criminals are by the general population. So Cartouche becomes one of these popular heroes who immediately passes into legend, and his exploits are put into print form and in various cheap formats, originally in these Bibliothèque Bleue chapbooks, which continue to be reprinted well into the mid-19th century, because other forms of printed literature were so expensive in those days. Books and newspapers were prohibitively expensive for the average person in the early 19th century. But then Cartouche even survives into the early 20th century, okay, in magazines and such. Now, another source of popular crime reading in France was the newspaper. And originally, newspapers were called canards, which is also the word for duck. But we also say that's a canard, right? Originally, canards or broadsides, which were sensational, embellished, and otherwise highly suspect accounts of crimes and executions, as well as other disasters like fires, earthquakes, floods, and such. These canards were less current events than they were bloody tales. They were called canards sanglants. And their telling was highly formulaic. Okay? They would typically have a woodblock image on the first page, along with the story of the crime, what the criminal was charged with, how the trial went, and then the execution, and would be modified with adjectives like horrible, lamentable, terrifying, strange, cruel, bloodthirsty, murder. And another typical feature of these was that they would have a lyrical ballad or a complaint that retold the crime story in verse and were set to a popular tune so that people could sing it during their day. Such canards were often printed up for distribution at the actual trials, at the actual execution of a criminal, but then were reprinted and continued to be circulated for decades afterwards. This canard tradition continued throughout most of the 19th century and was only eclipsed by newspapers toward the end of the 19th century, kind of the last third of the 19th century, and then was supplemented by something called faits divers, which are sort of diverse stories, sensationalist stories like we have from Le Petit Journal Illustré here. We have a drama in threes, and I'm not really sure what that means. Like the 3 sets of death here. Here the butcher kills pigs, and then he kills the woman, and then he kills himself, I guess. I'm not really sure. Okay. Now, I mention all this because this is going to be kind of the heart of part of my presentation today. I want to focus on these 2 figures. Eugène-François Vidocq, who became the chief of the Sûreté, or the security police, and Pierre-François Lacenaire, who was the poet assassin. Let's see. Oh, I thought I was here. We'll see what happens next. Did something here. Okay, we'll go on and talk about Vidocq first, okay? I have this bibliography up there, and you can sort of read that as I go on and talk about things. The case of Vidocq. In the case of what we have with Vidocq, the thing we're trying to figure out is, okay, we got these criminals. They're in these popular stories. The police are detectives, and yet Vidocq will become a detective, and he becomes kind of a popular hero as well. He'll become a popular hero because of writing his memoirs and other things as well. Okay? How is it that the detective becomes a hero when the police are pretty well despised? In the case of Vidocq, the criminal became both a police chief and a private detective while remaining essentially suspect or criminal himself. He was born in northern France near the Belgian border. Vidocq was a wild, rough child and a hot-tempered youth. He was known locally as Le Vautrin. Vautrin is a colloquial word for a wild boar. It's the same name that French novelist Balzac will give to his character Vautrin in a couple of his novels. During the French Revolution, as a young man, Vidocq joined the army, though not for any revolutionary reasons. He fought on both sides, both for the revolutionary side, French, and the counter-revolutionary Austrian forces. Occasionally, he deserted his regiments. For a period of time, he joined something called the roving army, which were these deserter soldiers who would pretend they were officers and then live off of the wealth of these aristocrats who were hiding out in the country trying to avoid the revolution altogether. Vidocq also became a lover of women, some of which had other male lovers as well, which aroused Vidocq's jealousy and got him in a number of fights. One of these was with a genuine army officer, and that altercation landed him in prison for the first time in 1795. He's in prison, he's meeting these other guys, and he and these other guys in this cell decide, and they manage to forge some release papers for one of their compatriots named Boitel. Boitel had been imprisoned for stealing wheat to provide his family for making bread. And this scenario of Boitel going to prison for stealing wheat will later be used by Victor Hugo in Les Miserables. This is Jean Valjean's crime as well, stealing bread for... Vidocq, after helping this one guy get out of prison, these other guys all staged their own prison break. But while he was on the lam, he was tried in absentia for this forgery project as well, and soon thereafter was reapprehended by the police and sent back to prison. Now he's got a longer prison sentence. Not only his original sentence, but his sentence for the forgery, compounded with the sentence of escaping from prison, which added time to his sentence. His life then became a vicious cycle of escapes, attempt at trying to live a normal life while he was on the outside. He would assume aliases. He'd take on the names of people who had died and tried to live as them, or he would steal people's passports and try to be that person. Eventually, he would always be found out and recaptured and sent back to prison again, and each time adding more time to his prison sentence. By 1809, he realized that such a way of living meant that he was likely to spend the rest of his life in heavy chains behind bars, if not rowing in the galleys. So he came up with this idea while he was still out before he was captured one time. He went to the 2nd Police Division, which was in charge of criminal affairs in Paris, and he talked to Monsieur Henry, about, who was the leader of the division at the time, and said, hey, how about I become a spy for you and you don't send me back to prison? And Commissioner Henry said, I don't think so, but I'll think about it. Well, Vidocq was arrested, went back to prison, and Henry came and visited him. And he said, tell you what, you become a spy for me while you're still in prison. We'll see how it goes, what we can do later. Vidocq was such a good police informant that this led to his release in 1812. And upon release, Henry made him the leader of a new body called the Security Squad, the Security Squad of Special Agents in Paris. Not only Vidocq, but he took some of his other, about a dozen of his other former inmates, and they formed this squad. And it was their job to ferret out criminals at large in Paris whom the police were having a hard time locating. Vidocq continued in this position for 15 years until he was released from service in 1827. In his memoirs, Vidocq claims that the regular police force had it out for him, and he had just had enough of these people, and so he voluntarily resigned. In a way, that was sort of true. The 2nd Division was under new leadership. Monsieur Henry was gone now, and the new head of the 2nd Division looked askance at a security squad of criminals and former criminals whom they were pretty sure engaged in blackmail and graft as part of their own operation. And this seemed like it might apply to Vidocq. At the time, he had an annual salary of 3,000 francs a year. He's been working for the police for 15 years now, yet he has personal assets that exceed 400,000 francs. So clearly there was something going on in his life besides his salary. In 1833, Vidocq started his own private detective agency to conduct investigations and surveillance into a variety of confidential affairs, mostly for business matters, in which he'd gather background information on individuals. Then he would use that information back sort of against people. His private investigation methods were so unorthodox that twice, in 1838 and 1843, he was tried and actually convicted of kidnapping, extortion, and blackmail. In both cases, though, it ended up working out in his favor. In the first case, he got a royal pardon that released him of his conviction. In the second case, he was tried, he was in prison, got a second trial, and then the primary person who had been the witness against him, somebody who he had extorted money from, recanted, and so he got out of prison that time as well. Toward the end of his life, Vidocq largely rested on his earlier laurels, although occasionally he was hired by the police to do this or that job for them. As easily as he acquired wealth, he burned through it, and by the time he died, he was actually impoverished. Okay? Oops. Here we go. Now, his exploits as a detective are, however, what gained him a widespread and popular audience, okay? Primarily through his highly embellished memoirs, originally published in 4 volumes, and then he also wrote a whole other series of books after that on criminality, as well as a book on what's called argot, or slang, on criminal slang. The memoirs were written, in fact, by ghostwriters. The first volume was written by a man named Emile Maurice. He was a pamphleteer and a popular short story writer. When the first book came out, Vidocq realized that it was just the first part of his life, and he was only a rogue. He hadn't even really started working for the police by the end of the first volume, and he was going, oh, this is the wrong impression. And so he wrote a preface saying, I was going to go over this really, really carefully before it got published, but I broke my arm. And I had a hard time correcting the proofs, and the publisher wanted, we had like a release date, and I didn't have a time, and then when it came out, I thought, oh, what I hired a hack writer to help me out here. Like, I turned it over to him to help me out, and he just like made a travesty out of this. I promise you, the forthcoming volumes will all be true, everything about them. So he did. He had a second one. François Lertier was his name, who was a struggling fiction writer of his own. In fact, they were no more true. Not only were they no more true, Lertier used like fiction he'd already written, but like hadn't been able to like get it all to work out and work some of that material into Vidocq's memoirs. Not only that, when he was done with this project, he wrote his own 2-volume supplement to the memoirs of Vidocq, which caused Vidocq to then have future runs say, unless this book bears my signature, it's not authentic. Okay? Now, what Vidocq promised his readers was an insider's perspective on the criminal milieu, although what readers really got were fantasies about Vidocq and his own self-aggrandizement as a hero, his exploits. Régis Maissac, who's one of the earliest French critics on detective literature, has noted that Vidocq's exploits follow a kind of uniform scheme. Here's what he says. He says, there's a theft, and Vidocq is charged with the investigation. He disguises himself as some low-life type. hangs out in a cabaret and straight away starts talking about the crime. Or by command, he gets one of his many stool pigeons to bring him the information. Once the thief is known, Vidocq worms his way into his good graces and obtains a confession or information that amounts to as much, such as the name and address of the front man, information about where the goods are stashed or hidden. As soon as this is obtained, the thief is arrested, and in dramatic fashion, Vidocq moves on to the next case. And that's really how these memoirs read, just one exploit after the other. They just go on and on. For the essential enigma for readers of this kind of crime and detective fiction, or in this creative nonfiction we'll call it, is not the classic whodunit, but it's just it's a mysterious train of the criminal milieu itself, its characters, its language, and the vast and secret criminal zone that Vidocq is going to reveal to the reader. In this way, Vidocq's memoirs were really an extension of that longer tradition of early banditry tales, when those authors would promise the same kind of insider knowledge that had been going all the way back to the 16th century. Vidocq also went straight to the people sometimes with his message. In both of his trials, he made these broadsheet handbills that would post to talk about how unfairly he was being treated by the police and the judicial system. In Liberty, you see here, but there's another one called Resurrection. In fact, he was guilty in both cases, as I mentioned already, but he presents himself as a popular hero, a hero to the people. He writes, "Now that I am free and at the head of my private enterprise, I no longer am constrained by the police. Now I run my own private detective agency. My own private enterprise, which has not been and never will be closed, however much crooks, fraudulent businessmen, and envious backstabbers, read the police, may desire it, as always, I will mercilessly unmask and subject to ridicule those who exploit the public trust, no matter what their social position they may occupy." Okay? Glossing over the issue of his near, if not actual, illegality of his own actions, the moral message behind Vidocq's motto was clear. Only my private detective agency, not the police, can provide honest society with the protection it needs against malefactors. When all's said and done, it's less surprising to me that Vidocq had been a criminal, or that he had mastered certain techniques of popular writing about the criminal milieu, than the fact that he turned the detective into a popular hero for the first time in French popular literature. At a time when the French still heavily mistrusted the police, Vidocq helped to ingrain the modern notion of the detective as a popular avenger. Okay? And now I'm going to move to the elegant criminal side with Lacenaire. Lacenaire, by contrast, became renowned precisely because he was an infamous criminal. And what's remarkable about his case, I think, is that he became a popular figure while remaining completely unrepentant about his criminal actions. He self-admittedly, he says, "I committed these crimes, and I did them for purely personal reasons," he said. Okay? Unlike the earlier criminals who would have that final supplication before their execution, right? Confess their crimes and then ask for forgiveness. Lacenaire remained entirely unrepentant. He also was a modern kind of criminal in that he was born into a privileged family. He doesn't come from the lower class, from the lower milieu. He came from a bourgeois family. His father was a merchant who invested all of his emotion and financial resources into his eldest son, much to the chagrin of the younger Pierre-François. As a child, Lacenaire esteemed himself as a free thinker, a poet, and an independent spirit. And as a schoolboy, he lashed out against social hypocrisy and the ideological indoctrination of his Jesuit education. And he began to steal from and con his mother out of money. After completing his formal education, Lacenaire experienced a fitful starts in a number of pretty boring entry-level jobs listed up here. At one point, he even borrowed some money from his aunt, saying, "I'm going to emigrate to America for a fresh start," but he didn't get enough money to do it. And then, quote, "Now, those of you who really want to understand me, listen carefully," he later wrote in his memoir. "For a long time, I hadn't realized that I could become a professional thief. Finally, I came across the memoirs of Vidocq, which made me realize that antipathy to society was a kind of class warfare." From this awareness, Lacenaire decided to practice thievery as an act of social defiance, individually directed when, where, and how he decided. He envisioned his vocation as a kind of duel with society, in which he would provide the intellect and will in planning crimes, and he would get some ruffian second to actually commit with the physical strength to execute them. In fact, few, if any, of his criminal plans ever panned out. On 2 early occasions, his bungling of thefts landed him in prison, and he learned about prison. He learned about criminals, and he learned about their language and ways. So after a few years of doing this small stuff and going to prison, he decided to think bigger, carry out armed robbery and even murder, if it came to that. And on 2 separate occasions, in December of 1834, he attempted just that with some accomplices. A man named Victor Avril for the first one, which was the murder of the widow Chandon and her son. Her son had been in prison with Avril and Lacenaire, and they knew him and didn't like him, but more they thought that his mother had money stashed there because of what he'd said in prison. And after Avril and Lacenaire kill her in their apartment, they find out they really don't have much in the house at all. And then another one with this fellow, Francois Martin, he decides to, they set up a scheme to rob a bank courier who they know is carrying money. And they did lure him into an apartment, but in that case, they bungled the murder part, and the guy was calling out for help, and they decided to run out in the street themselves and yell, "Help, help, there's a murder going on in the apartment." And so they got away with the money, but they didn't kill the fellow. And by January of 1835, within a month, Lacenaire had been arrested, and Avril and Martin had already been arrested, and they were set up to be put on trial for these murders and thefts. And initially, when the news first came out about this, the newspapers covered it, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, during his trial, all 3 of their trial actually, it was the 3 of them were tried together, the following November, Lacenaire became a cause célèbre for the aloof attitude that he maintained throughout the entire proceedings. Like, you're talking about somebody else here. He remained cool and disinterested about his fate. He remained contemptuous of both his criminal co-conspirators and of the prosecuting attorney. And he also came to court fashionably dressed. He had a very well-groomed, manicured mustache. The press commented on what a beautiful, handsome young man he was. And he fully admitted everything to the police about the crimes, which infuriated his co-conspirators, because they took the more typical thing. First of all, they did come from the working class milieu. They're not well-spoken. They're saying, "No, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong." And Lacenaire says, "You kidding? They did it with me, and here's what we did." So he was seen as this sort of elegant presence in court. All were found guilty. Lacenaire and Avril were sentenced to death, and Martin to life imprisonment. Okay? But in the period between his conviction and then his actual execution, which occurred in January of 1836, Lacenaire spent his final days in prison writing his memoirs. He also wrote poems, some of which had already been clandestinely published and circulated in advance of his execution. And throughout, he not only remained unrepentant, but reaffirmed his vocation as a criminal set against society. Okay? Curiously, the image of the elegant assassin took hold with the public, some of whom even wrote letters to the king asking for a stay of execution. Okay? Not on any appeal to morality or justice, because that case couldn't be made, simply because he's Lacenaire. You can't kill him. Okay? They did kill him. As a figure of as a figure of criminal rebellion, Lacenaire remained a popular figure throughout the 19th century at two levels. The popular reading level were these, again, bloody broadsides, like this one here that was distributed at his execution. But then, for like a middle-class reading audience, then there were actual books. Books are expensive. They cost like over 8 francs a piece. These things cost what's called a sou. It's a 5 centimes piece. Huge discrepancy in what it costs. 8 francs for a book, and your annual salary is about, if you're a worker in Paris, is about 300 francs a year. A newspaper subscription starts out in the 19th century at 80 francs a year. Okay? Gets slashed to 40, but even 40 out of a pool of 300 is still a big part of your salary. Throughout the 19th century, tales of Lacenaire are circulated, and then even into the 20th century. Lacenaire is featured, for example, in surrealist André Breton's anthology of black humor. He's a character in Marcel Carné's Children of Paradise, that famous movie that was made during the occupation of France, clandestinely. And his last days, when he's composing his memoirs and also receiving visitors, by the way, admirers and visitors come and visit him in his cell, was the theme of a 1992 movie, The Elegant Criminal, starring Daniel Auteuil, the French actor. Now, where I want to go with this, though, is to say that the greatest legacy of Vidocq and Lacenaire, however, was registered in popular crime fiction. Okay? Of the two figures, Vidocq has the greater high culture credentials. I already mentioned Balzac and humor, but also Vidocq was an inspiration in Eugene Sue's Mysteries of Paris. He formed the basis for the character in Alexander Dumas's, had as a detective called Jackal in The Mohicans of Paris, and other works as well. But when it came to popular fiction, particularly feuilletons, which were novels that were written in installments on a daily basis in newspapers or on a weekly basis in magazines. These feuilletons would go on for hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages. These first two here, for example, go on for thousands of pages. This, Monsieur Lecoq, is a self-contained novel. But although Gaboriau wrote a few Tabaret and Lecoq detective novels. In popular fiction, the influences of Vidocq and Lacenaire, I think, pretty much carry equal weight. Again, I already talked about Rocambole, this criminal anti-hero for the first half of the series, an Avenger hero for the second half. Ponson du Terrail was the most successful of all these feuilletonistes at the end of the 19th century, or sort of 1860s was his heyday. He died of a illness in 1870. But he was the most prolific and popular author of his age. Paul Féval wrote a criminal saga called The Black Coats. Les Habits Noirs means the black coats. The Black Coats are a secret criminal organization who are ruled by this elusive figure called the Colonel Bozo Corona, who is of uncertain age, but he's really, really ancient. He's at least 100 years old. Okay, and the Colonel Bozo Corona has a right-hand man working for him whose name is Lecoq. And Lecoq runs a private detective agency, and he's a criminal. He's part of the criminal gang. And Vidocq and Lecoq And also, Lecoq has another resonance in French, too, because it is Lecoq. The rooster Lecoq is one of the symbols of France as well. Okay? One of the traditional symbols of France is the rooster Lecoq. Okay? And so his Lecoq is this criminal, Émile Gaboriau, who finally in France writes a detective novel in which like decent, upstanding detectives are like at the heart of the story. His Monsieur Lecoq is one of those kind of detectives. But in this story, for example, in the middle of this story, Monsieur Lecoq, our detective, has tracked down the guilty party of the crime. He is a duke, the Duc de Sairmeuse. He's an aristocrat, and Lecoq is about to arrest him when the Duke just jumps over the garden wall and takes off. And Lecoq fails to apprehend him. Okay? The height of this kind of fiction occurs in the early 20th century with Les Terribles, the Terrible Three. The Terrible Three authors are Maurice Leblanc, Gaston Leroux, the same as the Phantom of the Opera, and Pierre Sylvestre and Marcel Alain. Maurice Leblanc, I mentioned Arsène Lupin before. Arsène Lupin is the gentleman burglar, and as I mentioned before, of these three, Leblanc is by far the best writer. He crafts very, very good, mostly short stories, very, very clever. Arsène Lupin is incredibly clever. He's a master of disguise. He has amazing wit. He is occasionally captured, but if he is, he figures out how to get out very, very carefully. Again, and he is a kind of private avenger. I mean, he's working as a detective, but he always is blackmailing people to get his pay. Gaston Leroux had a couple of popular series. Rouletabille, The Mystery of the Yellow Room is often talked about as a classic locked room mystery, but the solution is so unlikely that it sort of surpasses logic. And Fantômas, these guys, as I mentioned, Fantômas is just the bad guy. Inspector Juve pursues Fantômas, the evil Fantômas criminal, who is also a master of disguise. He can be anybody, anywhere, at any time. He keeps changing identities. Juve is never really sure who Fantômas is, and then he reaches the point of believing everybody's Fantômas. And potentially he could be. These guys wrote 32 of these novels in 32 months. They cranked out one a month. Each of them is about 400 pages long. Okay? But what's interesting about these elusive anti-heroes is that they're popular because they do things like outsmart the law. There's a whole series of stories where Arsène Lupin faces Sherlock Holmes, okay? the famous British detective. And in every encounter between Arsène Lupin and Sherlock Holmes, Arsène Lupin is more clever than Sherlock Holmes, okay? And despite the fact that Rouletabille is supposed to be this logical guy, in fact, after the first novel, there were 6 of these Rouletabille novels. After the first one, he just becomes an action-adventure hero. There's no pretense toward, rational crime solving after the first one. And Fantômas, as I mentioned, is just the Lord of Terror. We can see this is called a crimes employment agency, and this poor woman comes in there. She wants to be a maid, and the place explodes, and there's blood all over the place. Okay, all right. I'm just about going to wrap up here. I'm going to jump ahead beyond some other stuff and kind of get to the close here. Okay. Last 3 slides here. Where I'm getting here is that in the French popular crime tradition, detectives and criminals intertwine. If in the American tradition we see it as the development of one genre that leads to the subsequent development of this other genre, detective and then crime, in the French tradition, these things commingle always, all the way through in terms of the popular tradition. In the French tradition, it ends up confounding oppositions of criminal, detective and criminal. Who's the hero? Who's the anti-hero? Who's the pursuer, pursued? Security, insecurity, logic, imagination, virtue, vice, normalcy, subversion, conservative or revolutionary. It's these oppositions, they don't work as oppositions in this tradition. Okay. All right? And from originally scorned, para-literature is what the French gave a name to this whole realm of popular reading, right? It's not real literature. It's sort of like literature. It exists beside, below, other than literature. Today, however, as the French cling to like trying to establish French identity, it's a real. I mean, France has a real identity crisis these days. Some of these realms have now become part of the national identity, have become part of the self-image of the French. And they have continued to recycle even this stuff back from the 19th century. Rocambole, for example, appeared on the television series, a television feuilleton. There were also television feuilletons for Les Habits Noirs, the Black Coats. There was a Vidocq series on television. These were all in the 1960s. There was another one about Belphegor, the Phantom of the Louvre. Even contemporary, there are some contemporary movies. Pitoff, who's a special effects guy, made a movie called Vidocq. It has nothing to do with Vidocq. It's just an over-the-top sort of fantasy adventure movie. But there was an Arsène Lupin. There's going to be a new Fantomas movie is supposed to be released next year. But not just at the level of mass media, even at local culture. Last spring, while I was out and tootling around, my wife and I go through this little town called Fontvieille, whose claim to fame is they have Alphonse Daudet's windmill there. Daudet didn't own the windmill; it just inspired him to like write about windmills. And in this little town of just not many inhabitants, they were having like an evening talk by this guy Gerard Vial on Trotman. Trotman was a famous, mass murderer from 1869, and this became like a community event. People are coming to hear his talk about Trotman, okay, at the cultural center, at the little local cultural center, right? And here's my last slide: and not only is that old tradition sort of hung on to and recycled, but I think that it also makes its way into contemporary crime fiction as well. Fred Vargas is a current detective novelist living in France. She is probably the most internationally famous French detective novelist living today. She's actually, I love this, she's actually a historian. She's actually a trained medieval historian and archaeologist. That's what she does for her professional career, but she has this pseudonym, Fred Vargas, for writing her mystery stories. She has a few different series, but one of them is the Chief Inspector Adamsberg police thriller series. Chief Inspector Adamsberg, he's an intuitive detective, sort of like Simenon's Maigret, but these are things set in a modern crime atmosphere. Simenon at this point is very nostalgic for an older France, and this is very contemporary, and it has a lot of that kind of crime feel in it as well. But Adamsberg himself is an upright detective, operates more on like kind of getting a hunch and pursuing it rather than, logic. I wrote on my notes here, attention, spoiler alert, okay? So if you're one of those people that don't like to have the spoiler thing going, you need to turn off your ears or leave the room. These two books here are the same book, the second one in English translation, okay? Under the Gales of Neptune, or the English title is translated, Wash This Blood Clean From My Hand. I'm not really sure why. In this novel, pretty recent one, Adamsberg is investigating a number of murders. There have been a number of murders in which all the victims have 3 fatal puncture holes in their bodies. And they're like in a line. And after some time, Adamsberg comes to realize that these holes were made by a farmer's pitchfork. Okay? Not only that, with further investigation, they figure out that it's not any pitchforks being made today. Actually, it only matches this older style of pitchfork, one that was around even before World War II. And he keeps working the case. He works the case, and he figures out his culprit. He thinks his culprit is a man named Fulgence. Okay? There's a problem, though. I'm not sure if Fulgence is already alive, is still alive. In fact, Fulgence is dead. All of the records say that this guy is already dead. All right? His death certificate, all this stuff has been established. And not only that, if it was Fulgence, even though his evidence leads him there, he'd be an octogenarian. And he's going, how can an 80-plus-year-old guy be going around committing all these murders? Okay? It turns out that Adamsberg has to take his whole police Paris squad to Montreal. They have to go through some training. They have to get their forensics updated because they still use some pretty old-fashioned methods in Paris and in Canada. The police, like, they know all about all the new police methods. And so the French, okay, we got to go get trained. Okay. And while he's in Quebec, all of a sudden, victims with exactly the same holes made by exactly the same pitchfork start showing up. This leads Adamsberg's superiors back in Paris to conclude he's the murderer. Which he isn't. But Adamsberg has to become a criminal to complete his case because his own police want to arrest him. But he knows it's not him. He's convinced it's this other guy, and he's got to get back to France to apprehend him. He knows that he has to do this. So he gets his hair cut and dyed. He has to take on a complete disguise. He has to, like, get co-conspirators. He has to get a few of his own police officers to break the law, to hide and protect him, to forge him a passport so that he can go back, make his way back to Paris. And when he gets there, he has a rendezvous with Fulgence in Adamsberg's own apartment. Fulgence sits there and calmly admits to everything, and they have a conversation about how did you manage to do this and how did you manage to do that. And then Adamsberg has it set up. He has one of his associates is ready to burst in the door, and he does. When he bursts in the door with his revolver in hand, and there's Adamsberg, there's his agent. They've got him cornered. All they have to do is shoot him, and they can't do it. They let him go. What I'm saying here is that the French crime writing tradition that thoroughly blends detective and criminal is, I think, alive and well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Sure.
Robin. It's a pleasure. It does give you pause, doesn't it, to wonder if this Lacenaire's early tumble into crime was a rebellion against his Jesuit education. It makes you wonder just how many assassin poets have been spawned by Jesuit education over the years. Just thinking, I'm not saying.
I'm sure you're speaking from an insider's perspective, James.
We have a couple of minutes for any questions you might have, and feel free to ask them. I might ask you to wait until I can get the microphone to you because we're broadcasting it and taping it as well.
You mentioned on this last slide that this was a English translation.
Yes.
I wondered how many or all the others available in English as well, or?
Okay, not all of Fred Vargas's are, but I think there are about 6 of them that are in English translation now. One of the interesting things I found out in my historical research, in the late 18th and early 19th century, French popular literature was readily translated into English. But because of changing demographics, because of the way that, especially after the post-World War II era, the way that American culture came to dominate Europe and the world in general, far more English and American popular literature is translated into French, there's also just a plain demographic phenomena for why that's true, then work the other way around. So one of the remarkable things about Fred Vargas is that she's one of the few popular French writers who gets published. I mean, that's a Penguin Press book. It's not, you know, Europa who, you know, who does the, it's not the Incidents of the Hedgehog. What's the new one? That's The Elegance of the Hedgehog. That's it. Europa, it's a great press, but it's a specialty press, and, you know, Penguin's a, you know, pretty trade press.
Any other questions? Well, if not, I hope you'll join me again in thanking Robin for this evening, and join us again next week.
All right, thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks.